Emily Carter was found dead in her bedroom in 2004, an apparent suicide. 8 years later, Jessica Moore was discovered lifeless in her bathtub, also ruled a suicide. The only thing connecting them? Daniel Carter, the man who loved them both, and the man who may have murdered them years apart, staging each death to look like a tragic accident. In 2004, the quiet town of Bloomington, Indiana, was shaken by a sudden and tragic death. Emily Carter, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher known for her kindness and gentle nature, was found lifeless in the bedroom of her home. She was lying, on top of her neatly made bed, her hands folded across her chest, an empty pill bottle on the nightstand and a handwritten note on the pillow beside her. The cause of death was determined to be an overdose of sleeping pills. The note, brief and apologetic, hinted at personal struggles and ended with a sorrowful goodbye. The police arrived quickly, and after a brief investigation ruled the death a suicide. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible injuries beyond what the overdose would cause, and no evidence of foul play. The note seemed to confirm the theory, and with no immediate red flags, the case was closed within days. It was a devastating blow to everyone who knew Emily. She had dedicated her life to teaching and was beloved by her students and peers. Her funeral drew a large crowd, all trying to come to terms with the sudden loss of someone so full of promise. Emily had been married for 5 years to Daniel Carter, a quiet, soft-spoken man who worked as a local mechanic. He was described as polite and somewhat introverted, rarely socializing outside of his small circle. To many, Daniel and Emily seemed like the picture of a happy, if reserved, couple. They had bought their house just 2 years prior and were known to keep to themselves. Daniel appeared utterly broken by Emily's death. He sobbed through the funeral, avoided public appearances afterward, and told friends that life had no meaning without her. Behind closed doors, however, the story was more complicated. Emily had suffered a miscarriage just months before her death, and while she had returned to work, her sister Laura said she hadn't quite been herself. There were moments of silence during conversations, forced smiles, and lingering sadness. Laura noticed her becoming more withdrawn, but chalked it up to grief. When the news of Emily's death broke, Laura was heartbroken, but also deeply confused. Emily had never expressed suicidal thoughts. She had in fact talked about trying for another child just 2 weeks before. Something about the story didn't make sense. Laura was especially unsettled by the suicide note. It was written in shaky, uneven handwriting that didn't match the confident cursive Emily had always used in her letters and journals. The wording was strange, impersonal. It lacked Emily's usual warmth and phrasing. Laura brought up her concerns to police, but with no evidence of wrongdoing, there was little they could do. A grieving husband, a tragic loss, and a note that, on the surface, explained it all. Shortly after the funeral, Daniel sold the house and left town. He told neighbors he couldn't bear the memories and needed to start over. No one questioned him. Everyone believed it was just the aftermath of unimaginable loss. What they didn't know was that this would not be the last time Daniel Carter would find himself standing beside the body of a woman he was supposed to love. By 2012, Daniel Carter had completely reinvented himself. He had moved across the country to Oregon and adopted a new name, Daniel Reeves. He settled in the city of Eugene, started a job as an auto technician, and seemed to live a quiet, unremarkable life. To those who met him, Daniel was a reserved but polite man who kept to himself and avoided unnecessary attention. He didn't speak about his past. Most people assumed he had simply gone through something difficult and wanted a fresh start. It was in Eugene that he met Jessica Moore, a 29-year-old veterinary nurse who was known for her energy, compassion, and love for animals. Jessica had a close group of friends, a supportive family, and a promising future. She was drawn to Daniel's calm demeanor, and within a few months the two began dating. Friends said they seemed happy together, even though Daniel remained private about his background. Jessica would sometimes say he had been through a lot and didn't like to talk about it. She respected that, and for a while things went smoothly. In early 2013, Jessica and Daniel moved in together. They rented a small but cozy house on the edge of town. Jessica decorated the place with colorful throw pillows, plants, and framed photos of her family. Daniel kept mostly to the garage, where he worked on cars in his spare time. Outwardly, they appeared to be a couple building a life together. Jessica's co-workers noticed she seemed more distracted than usual, but when asked, she would brush it off, saying she was just tired. A year later, in 2014, tragedy struck again. Jessica was found dead in the bathroom of their home. Her wrists were slit, and a typed suicide note was carefully placed on the bathroom counter. She had allegedly written that she felt like a burden and couldn't go on living this way. Daniel said he had returned home from running errands and found her in the tub. He called out to a neighbor who then contacted the police. Once again, the authorities investigated and, despite some initial questions, concluded it was a suicide. There were no signs of forced entry. The scene was clean, almost staged. Jessica's laptop showed the note had been typed just hours before. Her body showed no signs of a struggle. Police considered the case closed. Daniel, for the second time, in a decade, was labeled a grieving partner and left uncharged. But the people closest to Jessica weren't convinced. Her mother said Jessica had been looking forward to her upcoming birthday and a planned vacation to the coast. Her best friend revealed that Jessica had recently been promoted at work and had spoken about long-term goals. None of it aligned with someone preparing to take her own life. Still, their suspicions were dismissed. Daniel quietly attended the memorial, accepted condolences, and once again withdrew from public view. Within weeks, he collected Jessica's life insurance, another policy that had been adjusted shortly before her death. He then left the area, changed his contact information, and disappeared once again. No one knew it yet, but a chilling pattern was beginning to emerge. In 2018, 4 years after Jessica Moore's death, a sharp-eyed true crime blogger named Michelle Rayner stumbled upon her obituary while researching cases for a series on suspicious suicides. What caught her attention wasn't just the young age or the tragic nature of the death. It was the eerily composed tone of the brief online article. Something about it felt too clean, too tidy. As Michelle dug deeper, she came across the typed suicide note mentioned in police summaries and the fact that the victim had no prior mental health diagnoses or recorded history of self-harm. It was just another tragic case, officially ruled a suicide, that seemed to leave more questions than answers. But what truly sparked Michelle's curiosity was a detail buried in a local news comment section. A user who claimed to be a former neighbor mentioned that Jessica's boyfriend had disappeared after the funeral and was a very private man with a sad past. Michelle decided to trace his name, Daniel Reeves. A few hours into her research, she discovered that Daniel Reeves didn't exist in public records before 2010. That alone was suspicious. Digging further, she uncovered an old address tied to him back in Indiana. That's when she found Emily Carter. The moment Michelle read about Emily's death in 2004, another woman who had died from a supposed suicide, married to a man named Daniel Carter, the pieces began to form a pattern. Both women were in committed relationships with a man named Daniel. Both had died in the privacy of their homes. Both left behind notes that seemed unnatural, and both cases had been closed quickly without any criminal charges. Most unsettling of all, both had life insurance policies changed or initiated not long before their deaths, and in both cases, Daniel had been the sole beneficiary. Michelle wrote an in-depth blog post connecting the two deaths. She didn't make accusations, but she asked hard questions and laid out the timeline in a clear, haunting fashion. The article quickly gained traction on social media and caught the attention of true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators. People began to share the post widely. Emily Carter's sister, Laura, who had long believed her sister's death wasn't what it seemed, saw the blog and immediately contacted the Indiana State Police again. This time, she wasn't alone. With the added pressure of public interest, authorities in Indiana and Oregon reopened the investigations. Forensic analysts began re-examining the suicide notes. Handwriting experts compared the note left by Emily to her school journals and classroom paperwork. It didn't match. In fact, it didn't even come close. Meanwhile, digital experts looked into Jessica's laptop and traced the origin of the suicide note found near her body. It had been created on a word processor linked to a user account registered under Daniel's name just hours before her death. Insurance records were pulled. Daniel had collected large payouts from both deaths. Financial records showed that in the months leading up to each woman's death, he was in debt. But shortly after each tragedy, his financial troubles vanished. What began as a gut feeling from a blogger turned into a coordinated investigation across state lines. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with isolated tragedies. They were looking at a disturbing pattern left behind by a man who had, carefully hidden in plain sight. The illusion of coincidence was unraveling. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement agencies from Indiana and Oregon worked together to re-examine the evidence that had once been overlooked or dismissed. What had seemed like two separate suicides were now beginning to look like carefully staged murders. Investigators combed through old case files, autopsy reports, crime scene photos, and digital footprints. Slowly, inconsistencies started to surface, small details that didn't fit the narrative of suicide, but had gone unnoticed because no one had been looking for foul play. In Emily Carter's case, the suicide note had always raised quiet doubts in her sister's mind, but now it raised professional red flags. Forensic handwriting experts confirmed that the note did not match Emily's writing. The slant, pressure, and letter formations were inconsistent with known samples. Even more troubling, the note had been written with a pen found in Daniel's office, not in any of the usual places Emily kept her personal items. On its own, it might have meant little, but in the larger context, it took on a sinister weight. Crime scene investigators noticed that Emily's bedroom had been unusually clean. The bed was made, the floors vacuumed, and the bathroom spotless, all odd for a sudden, impulsive act like suicide. There were no smudges on the pill bottle, no food or drink residue near the bed, and no evidence she had even touched the pills that allegedly killed her. The autopsy showed a massive dose of sleeping medication in her system, but her stomach contents didn't match someone who had willingly ingested that quantity. It was enough to open serious questions. Meanwhile, Jessica Moore's case was unraveling, even faster. The typed note had initially been treated as evidence of intent, but digital forensic specialists found metadata that showed the document had been created and edited using a laptop registered to Daniel's account. Even more damning, the file had been accessed multiple times the night before Jessica died, long before she would have had any chance to write it herself. Investigators discovered that Jessica had written several emails in the weeks leading up to her death, expressing unease about Daniel. One unsent draft said she was thinking about leaving him and mentioned financial control issues. Autopsy results that were previously considered routine were now reviewed with fresh eyes. The angle and depth of the wounds on Jessica's wrists suggested hesitation marks were missing, something usually present in self-inflicted cuts. Her phone was mysteriously wiped of recent messages. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices the night before her death, but none of them had been interviewed. During the initial investigation, one chilling detail stood out in both cases. Daniel hadn't been the one to discover either body first. In both instances, he had delayed calling emergency services until someone else was on the scene. With Emily, he asked a neighbor to check on her while he waited outside. With Jessica, he called out to a passerby before contacting 911. It was a calculated move to appear removed from the actual moment of discovery, perhaps to avoid suspicion. The evidence was piling up, and the image of Daniel Carter, quiet, grieving, unlucky in love, began to fall apart. Behind the calm exterior was a man who had seemingly orchestrated two deaths with careful planning, leaving just enough doubt to walk away untouched. But now the cracks in his story were spreading wide open, and the truth that had been buried for years was finally beginning to surface. In 2020, after nearly 2 decades of deception, Daniel Carter, also known as Daniel Reeves, was arrested at a small mechanics shop in rural Nevada. He had once again changed his name and relocated, attempting to stay one step ahead of suspicion. But this time investigators were ready. Armed with forensic evidence, digital trails, and witness statements, they arrived quietly and took him into custody without incident. He offered no resistance, only a stunned expression that suggested, for the first time, he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling. The news of his arrest spread quickly. Families of both Emily Carter and Jessica Moore were notified, and the overwhelming sense of long-awaited justice began to take shape. Emily's sister Laura wept openly during a press conference, stating she had never stopped believing her sister's death was not what it seemed. Jessica's mother expressed sorrow and rage in equal parts, saying she had always felt something was wrong but had no power to prove it. Now, with the truth out in the open, both families were preparing for the legal battle that would follow. The trial began in early 2022, drawing national attention. Prosecutors presented a meticulous timeline showing how Daniel had manipulated his partners emotionally and financially before killing them. The evidence included expert testimony on the forged suicide notes, metadata from the files on Jessica's laptop, autopsy re-evaluations, and financial records showing Daniel's sudden financial windfalls following both deaths. They painted a picture of a man who had mastered the art of appearing broken while actually being cold and calculating. Daniel, they argued, had preyed on women he believed no one would question his relationship with, partners who trusted him completely. His defense team struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. They attempted to discredit the forensic findings and suggested that the emotional weight of depression in both women's lives couldn't be ruled out. But the jury wasn't convinced. The revelations of falsified documents, delayed emergency calls, and the uncanny similarities between the two deaths created a narrative that was too compelling to ignore. Even Daniel's quiet demeanor during the trial worked against him, seen not as grief, but as emptiness, a man without remorse. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. Daniel Carter showed no reaction. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, the verdict brought a sense of closure but not peace. Emily and Jessica were gone, their lives stolen, and their stories twisted into falsehoods for years. The weight of knowing the truth had been buried for so long was heavy, but now finally it was acknowledged. Justice had caught up with a man who thought he could outwit it forever. Daniel was transferred to a maximum security prison where he would live the rest of his days. No more new names, no more second chances. Just the truth, finally revealed, and the silence left behind by the women whose voices he had tried to erase.